Alright, hello everybody, here we go, second video of Unit 3. We're going to really get into the thick of it, start to understand all these events that are going to ultimately lead to the inevitable American Revolution. So just to pick up where we left off, remember we discussed the end of the French and Indian War in the last video. So realize that because the British had amassed a great deal of war debt, even though they won that war, they were trying to figure out ways to make back all that money. So the British in the war insisted that they were protecting the colonies, and thus when they start to tax them and issue other forms of new control over the colonies, they thought that was just. But Americans pushed back on that. The British defended their new efforts to consolidate control over the colonies by arguing they were virtually representing them in Parliament, that every member of Parliament still had the interests of the entire British Empire, including the colonies, in mind. But we'll talk about how the Americans don't really think that's true once we get to talking about taxes. The British also are attempting, before we even get into these examples of new taxes, the colonists had a fairly long-standing habit of avoiding taxation anyway. We did not talk about the Navigation Acts. We actually skipped that section of the reading, but there were acts of legislation in place that attempted to generate revenue for the British Empire. The Navigation Acts were a set of laws that required all goods that were traded to pass through British ports so they could be taxed. So that explains why colonists were smuggling so many goods. They didn't want to pay taxes on them. So the British issued what were called writs of assistance, which were essentially search warrants. It allowed them to search any American colonial ship for smuggled goods in an effort to collect money, right? And also in an effort to try to stop smuggling to begin with. But the colonists, even though smuggling was technically illegal, they thought this was an unfair exercise of power over their trade. So that's one example of a new effort to consolidate British control that the colonists rejected. And another thing, and this is left over from the previous video, but remember that the Proclamation of 1763 also deeply angered colonists who wanted to settle farther west. They thought that the British didn't have any authority to control that. So all of this shows that that period of salutary neglect, that basically 80-ish year period where the British allowed the colonies essentially to self-govern so long as they were able to freely trade with one another, this was coming to an end, right? The British now were attempting to directly control the colonies, but because salutary neglect had lasted for so long, the colonists were not willing to accept all these new efforts to control them. So, hence the beginning of new forms of taxes. So the Sugar Act, the first example from 1764, actually, ironically, it was a reduction in the molasses tax, but the colonists still opposed it, because remember, they had been smuggling goods for quite a bit of time, and they typically didn't pay taxes on them anyway. They ignored those Navigation Acts. So this, along with those writs of assistance, were seen as an attempt to, again, assert more control over colonial trade in sugar specifically, and they rejected that. But the Stamp Act is much more widespread, and this is why this is so important. This is why you probably already heard about this before reading about it. So first of all, it was a direct tax rather than a regulatory tax, right? Meaning regulatory taxes are an attempt to control something like trade, right? A tariff is a good example of a regulatory tax, right? But this was just a tax on all paper goods that were circulated throughout the colonies. And remember that the colonists were much more literate than their British counterparts. There was an attempt to educate, in particular in New England, right? Religious education allowed more colonists to be able to read. And so there were a lot of paper goods in circulation. And essentially the stamp tax taxed everything, right? Whether it was a trade record, a newspaper, a book, a pamphlet, everything had this stamp on it that the colonists had to pay for. Now, like the sugar tax, this tax was not very high, but because the colonists did not directly benefit from it, they saw this solely as a means for the British to gain revenue. Again, revenue rather than regulation. This is a really big deal, a good thing to remember. Again, because the Sugar Act was regulatory, there was opposition to it, but it was less widespread. Right, and it was not uncommon for empires to try to issue taxes to regulate trade. And another source of the opposition for the Stamp Act, I already said, the colonists were way more literate, so it was much more widespread, and it impacted virtually every colonist. And the Sugar Act really only impacted people directly involved in the sugar trade. The colonists saw this as an example, or saw this as proof that virtual representation was essentially a farce. They did not consent to being taxed, so therefore they criticized taxes like the Stamp Act as taxation without representation. They said it's not fair to levy these taxes if there aren't any Americans sitting in Parliament that can reject these taxes. So, of course, they start to resist them. And there's political forms of resistance to taxation and social forms of resistance. So let's start with the political. The Stamp Act Congress was formed as a reaction to the Stamp Act. It was an intercolonial Congress. 9 out of the 13 colonies participated. And what they did was they drafted a set of resolutions to try to put pressure on Britain to repeal the Stamp Act. And one of the most effective resolutions that they passed was a boycott, right? Boycotting, of course, has a major economic impact on the British, right? If people suddenly are no longer exchanging paper goods, or if they're exchanging them in a covert way to avoid putting stamps on them, then British aren't going to make any money, and the Stamp Act isn't really going to have any purpose if it doesn't collect any revenue. So this is interesting because we saw in the previous video an attempt to have political cooperation between the colonies with Ben Franklin's Albany Plan, but that never came to fruition. So the Stamp Act Congress is the earliest example of an intercolonial political effort to accomplish something, right? In the Albany Plan of Union, it was an attempt to consolidate for defensive reasons, so it was not anti-British, but the Stamp Act Congress is anti-British, which is a really interesting new development. And it can pave the way for the continental congresses that form once the revolution is essentially underway. Another form of political consolidation or cooperation were these committees of correspondence. It allowed increased communication between the colonies. The colonial leaders created these committees, and it was a way for them to discuss effective methods to resist new taxes. So essentially, there was much more widespread communication, even though the committees of correspondence were created by the government, so it was created by the elite. Lay people unaffiliated with the government were also effectively exchanging ideas on how to resist taxation, partially due to these committees of correspondence. There was also a social response, which was a little bit more aggressive at times, right? So this was just regular residents, not affiliated with government, and they formed to lead major protests, and again, they occasionally got violent and forceful. Sometimes the violent resistance included burning tax collectors in effigy. That means basically they create like a little dummy that looked like a tax collector, and they'd set it on fire, hang it from a noose. They also occasionally tarred and feathered tax collectors, which could literally be deadly. And the most famous vigilante social group that formed in resistance to the Stamp Act and other taxes that come later is the Sons of Liberty. It was led by Samuel Adams, who was the cousin of John Adams, so a very famous figure. And the combination of political and social responses to these taxes made it so that the British essentially had no choice but to repeal the Stamp Act. And they repealed it in 1766, only 1 year after it was passed. But the British aren't just completely waving the white flag here. They immediately followed the Stamp Act repeal with something called the Declaratory Act, which said that Parliament could pass laws on the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So even though they repealed the Stamp Act, it was their way of continuing to try to flex their political muscle over the colonies. And when we get to the next section of Foner, we're going to see how the Declaratory Act sort of laid the foundation for future taxes. Now, even despite these examples of resistance here, the colonies were by no means completely united. We see some problems in the West in particular. Small country farmers, calling themselves the regulators, started to resist colonial assemblies' policies. They argued that they were not fairly represented in colonial assemblies. So this makes me think again of Bacon's Rebellion, where you start to see a little bit of an urban-rural divide. These regulators resisted paying taxes because they argued that their tax dollars were going more towards the wealthy elite in the cities. They often violently resisted taxation. They did things like attack land speculators, traders, tax collectors. They stormed court meetings and disrupted them. This grew. By the early 1770s, there were actually thousands of regulators in the countryside, but they were able eventually to be controlled by colonial militias by the early 1770s, and the timing worked out here, I suppose, to control the regulators, because by the early 1770s, we're going to see that there is a lot more tension between the colonists and the British, with new taxes we're going to talk about next time. And so because of the formation of militias to resist the British, they were also able to effectively control resistance in the countryside. So just the fact that the regulators existed at all shows that even though we're seeing some intercolonial agreements, right, with the Stamp Act Congress Committees of Correspondence, by no means are the colonies completely united here. We have a long ways to go, and that's even going to continue even after the revolution is underway. So that basically covers last night's reading. We're going to keep talking about new taxes next time, so I hope this was helpful. See you later.